my pleasure to introduce Ms. Amy Pope, the coordinator of the UN Network on Migration and the Director General of IOM, to open the annual meeting. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, I want to welcome you, everyone, those of you who are online and those of you who are in the room, to our 5th annual meeting of the United Nations Network on Migration. Now, this is my first meeting as the network coordinator, and I am so thrilled to see so many of our partners here, representing the network, representing our member states, representing our partners within the UN family, and representing champion countries. We're so pleased that you all are part of this discussion. More importantly, we're really pleased that you're part of the work. And our annual meeting is really about bringing us all together, demonstrating what the network means, which is that none of us can do it alone and that we must rely on partnerships to do this work. Supporting migrants, supporting their communities, supporting the implementation of the Global Compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration. This requires every single person who is sitting in this room. It is a team effort. It is not something one government can do alone. It is not something that even governments can do alone. We need all facets of society rowing in the same direction. And at every single point along the way, even and especially in today's meeting, as we all gather today, we need to remember why we're doing this. It is not just so you get to see your friends and your colleagues and to reconnect. It is to make sure that we hold dear the principal tenet that every person matters, every migrant matters, regardless of their legal status, regardless of their background or their nationality or their ethnicity, regardless of their circumstance. Every single migrant, every single human being deserves dignity and deserves protection. I'm sad to say, even as we gather with this very kind of lofty goal in mind, over 6,600 migrants died or went missing last year. Yesterday, we announced that over 100 migrants, or almost 100 migrants, have died or gone missing in the Mediterranean just this last month, just since the beginning of 2024. These are just the numbers we know about. Unfortunately, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this is today's reality. And this is something that we need to remember as we pursue our work. This is about real people. And without the collective work of this group of people, we are talking about losing valuable lives, losing tremendous capacity, losing investment in our collective future. So over the next 2 days, you're going to hear from a broad range of speakers drawn from our states, our stakeholders, civil society, journalism, academia, and from the UN system. We and I and they also hope we hear from all of you, because we want to make sure that what we're doing works. We encourage you to be short, be direct. Let's not admire the problem. We all know we have a problem. I just said that 6,600 migrants died or went missing last year. That means we have a real problem. But let's go beyond admiring the problem and let's be focused on pragmatic solutions. We want your feedback. We want your candor. We very much welcome constructive feedback on how we can improve. But let's focus on why we're here. How do we move forward? How do we make sure that we have impact and we do so with purpose? We are beginning today by setting the scene, and I am absolutely delighted to be up here with this tremendous panel. We have here in person Professor Hein Haas to my left, and one of my favorite voices for women, or young women and young people, Rose Kobusinge. Online, we have Mr. Jose Antonio Vargas, and we're going to set the scene for you today as we begin this conversation. Then we're going to talk about the money. Because we all know we can all have the best objectives, but without the funding, we can't actually accomplish what needs to be done. So we're going to follow it on a consultative forum on the Migration Multi-Partner Trust Fund to include past and present members of our steering committee. And they're going to tell you how the fund works, what the status is of it, and how we can use the money better going forward. And we're going to look at 3 things, right? How do we maximize the development promise of migration? How do we protect migrants' rights and save lives? And how do we think about the future of migration? And I hope our discussions are going to guide our collective thinking, and most importantly, will guide our collective action as we move forward throughout the next year. Now, this is a big year. for those of us who are advocates and participants in these conversations on the Global Compact for Safe, Regular, and Orderly Migration. This is the second round of the regional reviews are going to begin soon on March 11th for member states of the Europe and Central Asia region under the auspices of the UNECE. And then there will be 5 regional reviews in total, which will be preceded by multi-stakeholder consultations. We will set up discussion spaces on the Migration Network Hub, and we want you to be actively involved. We're going to discuss how we strengthen regional, sub-regional, and interregional cooperation. And our goal is really to deliver on the promise of the GCM, recognizing that it is going to inform the next global review, or IMRF, in 2026. Now, there's a danger that we get stuck in the bureaucracy and the processes of meetings and checklists and talking points and fact sheets, and that we forget ultimately about the work that we are all meant to do. So really, what we're trying to do is impact the lives of millions of people who are on the move today and impact the lives of the millions of people who host those who are on the move today. So we want to make sure that we are very, very concrete. This is all going to inform the next Secretary General's report. It's going to be released later this year. And we want you to be actively involved in contributing to this report. It's not a report for the sake of a report. It's a report for the sake of assessing where we are in this process and what more we need to do. It's also going to include preliminary recommendations on the indicators so we can assess how we're doing. It's effectively a report card for all of us. And it will present, which has been requested by the General Assembly, recommendations on how we provide humanitarian assistance to migrants who are in distress and to really take on this tragedy of migrants who are going missing. So, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, friends and colleagues, we are meeting at a critical moment in time. I am sure you already know it is the year of the polycrisis. We are seeing multiple disasters around the world. It is also the year of elections. More than half of the countries around the world will have elections. But remember who does not vote. Migrants do not vote. And what we see far too often is migrants become the scapegoating for everything that is going wrong within a society. We are seeing migrants who do not have the right to vote being labeled as the factors driving higher crime, lack of governance, poor job or employment rates, or inflation. And we know in real life that is not true. We know in real life the facts actually show us something quite different. And we know worse is that this process of scapegoating migrants actually contributes to the concept of migrants as being less than human. And our job collectively is to draw attention back to the very human story that is captured in every single migrant around the world, to draw us back to the amazing potential capacity that exists in every single person who is on the move in the world today. Migration is ultimately about our own civilization. Humans are a mobile species. Without migration, you would not all be sitting here today. I would not be sitting here today. But sadly, that story is being lost. And so, first and foremost, we are asking all of you to be part of changing the conversation, to move away from a conversation where it's just about people invading communities or overwhelming social services, and to recognize that when we do migration well, when we create opportunities for people to live, to work, to flourish, to be safe, that we actually create tremendous development opportunities, whether it's for the migrant herself, whether it's for the community she's coming from, or the community that she's going to. We know that to get there is not easy, and I don't want to pretend it is, but that's why all of you and the role that you're playing here today is absolutely critical. So I am very, very pleased to be here as part of the coordinator on the network, to have the GCM, to have this community of people, to have champions in civil society within our member states, within our UN partners, so that we can all drive forward not only a better narrative around migration, but better outcomes for migration. So we are going to keep on expanding our tent. Everybody is welcome. We recognize everybody brings value, and we want to make sure that we can work together. because, ladies and gentlemen, we have a big, big task ahead of us, and the road is not easy. So we need to be working hand in hand to get there. So with that, I will stop talking and I will open up the conversation.
Thank you very much, DG. It's now my great pleasure to moderate the opening session. And following on from the DG's comments, this is really a series of reflections on how we can improve and strengthen the migration narrative. And we have three panelists with us today. Firstly, and I'll introduce them all before turning to them. Firstly, Hein de Haas. He's a sociologist, a geographer, currently professor at Amsterdam University, previously at Oxford. It's very timely that he's here with us today, and we're very grateful. He recently published a book, How Migration Really Works. And if English isn't your first language, it's soon to be translated into a raft of other languages. I thoroughly recommend it. Secondly, and online, joining us from California, so I am immensely grateful to him for staying up at such an antisocial hour. We have Jose Antonio Vargas. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, an Emmy-nominated filmmaker, a Tony-nominated producer. And he's a leading voice for the human rights of immigrants and founded the non-profit media advocacy organization Define American. He will soon be having a book, White is Not a Country, coming out later in this year. And finally, also on the panel with us in the room, we have Miss Rose Kobusinge. She's a migration, environment and climate change youth ambassador from Uganda. She's at the forefront of leading climate action and rallying young people, policymakers and stakeholders to address the intersection of climate change and human mobility, amplifying the voice of the Global South in this regard. Rose is also an IOM AU youth ambassador. I'm extremely grateful to you all for being here today. A couple of things before we kick off. Amy, my Amy, announced that we have Slido. I'm going to read very literally here because I don't understand Slido. But if you use these QR codes, a question will come up for each session, and we would love to hear your views for each session, and they'll pop up on the screens in one form or another. And the opening question for this session is from the comments you're about to hear from our panelists, what most strikes you as areas that you think the network should engage in moving forward? I hope this is user-friendly. I hope it is a fun and dynamic way of engaging. Before, obviously, we hear from you in taking questions from the floor. Now I'm going to turn to the panelists with the plea. This is my final comment, is I have blood pressure issues, and the biggest problem for my blood pressure is time management. So I really want to hear from as many people as possible. So keep your interventions as short and punchy as possible. I'm going to turn to Hein, if I may. As I mentioned, Hein, the title of your recent book, How Migration Really Works, perhaps implies that we either haven't been understanding it properly or explaining it clearly, or perhaps both. So can you tell us what lessons you learned from its writing and how you would like to see the migration discussion evolve? Thank you.
Hi, Timmy here. It's really an honor to speak to this room full of experts on this topic. That's quite a question. What have I learned? Well, I think what I've learned is that you think migration is such a hotly debated topic, you'd think there's a lot of knowledge about it, but it seems to be that because it is so hotly debated, it seems to be quite poorly understood for the reason it's so hotly debated. And what I discovered writing the book is that one of the main problems is the framing of the debate, because just facts alone are not enough. It's the whole framing of the debate in sort of pro and anti terms. And this is, of course, a very unproductive way of talking about migration, actually quite silly. For instance, imagine a journalist ask an economist whether he or she is in favor of the economy. And it sort of already makes clear how silly it indeed is. I mean, arguing against or in favor of migration is like arguing against in favor of markets, for instance, work or agriculture. And it leads to a sort of thinking of migration away from what it is, a fundamental element of who we are, who we've always been, and who we will be as human beings, as societies, something that we simply cannot think away. And the polarization of the debate between those anti and pro forces has led to the nuance basically going out of the window, in which pro and anti camps exaggerate the harms and benefits of migration. And this whole simplistic polarized framing has been paralyzing migration debates for decades now. And it's a major obstacle for gaining a better understanding of migration because it leaves no room for nuance. So we urgently need a new vision on migration. And that's where I hope to contribute to in my book. Not based on an understanding of migration either as a problem to be solved or as a solution to problems, but as it is, a more scientific way of looking at migration. And this by necessity means we need a holistic view that tries to understand migration as an intrinsic and therefore inseparable part of broader processes of social, cultural, and economic change, both in destination and origin societies. Well, looking at the debate and the policies, the central claim of my book is that policies have often failed or have even been completely counterproductive because they are based on an inaccurate understanding of the nature, causes, and consequences of migration. So in many ways, the migration crisis we see around the world, for instance, in the Mediterranean or on the US-Mexican border, are self-inflicted crises. And this is why 30 to 40 years of more of the same policies haven't generally solved any problem, but have often made things actually worse. So we need that new vision based on facts rather than fears, on evidence rather than propaganda. And what I will do in the rest of my contribution is highlight these needs by discussing a few key myths I also address in my book about migration. Now, let me start with the first one. The most commonly shared idea about migration, both on the left and the right, many organizations dealing with migration, is that we live in times of unprecedented mass migration. And this is often linked to issues of poverty, inequality, conflict, and recently climate change, along with this idea that improvements of infrastructure, communication, transport have led to this increasing pace, this acceleration of world migration. Some even say migration is spinning out of control, amalgamating into this notion of a global migration or refugee crisis. However, if we look at the longer term and if we look at the data, we have quite a lot of reason to be quite skeptic towards such claims. For instance, if we look at the total number of international migrants, it looks pretty staggering indeed. But expressed as a percentage of the world population, we talk about roughly 3% of the world population. If we go back half a century ago, the percentages were rather similar, although we had less countries. That's a reminder. So in a way, you could even say perhaps there are relatively less migrants. Well, apart from the data, I'll leave that alone. There's good reasons to question that thing. But of course, a lot of things have changed in migration. What has changed is the dominant geographical direction of global migration flows. And it has to do with the changing place of Europe on the global migration map. Europe used to be the main source of colonists, soldiers, enslavers, missionaries, settlers, and migrants to the Americas, Australia, New Zealand, and other colonies in Africa and Asia. And you could say, well, the Europeans never asked permission to do that. So that was historically the biggest illegal migration in human history. And this was an invasion. Unlike migrants today, Europeans did come with weapons and gunboats. Well, since the Second World War, those patterns have been reversed. Europe has transformed from a main source of world migrants to settler colonies to a major destination of migrants from former colonies and other non-European countries. And the drying up of Europe as a main source of migrants also had consequences for migration to the Americas, Australia, New Zealand, and other destinations. So it is not really about levels of immigration. For instance, a century ago, 15% of the US population was an immigrant. Today, we have a similar percentage. It's really about the composition. And what it reveals is a very Eurocentric bias in the way we think about migration, that everything is different. Looking from other countries, things perhaps look less different. Second myth is this idea, very common amongst governments, is that border restrictions reduce migration. And it seems like a no-brainer. The more difficult you make it to come, it should somehow lead to less immigration. Perhaps policies are not perfect, but still, that is the basic reasoning. And that's why we've put up so many walls and fences, right? However, again, it's based on quite a simplistic assumption and understanding of migration. Because if you really want to understand how a restriction affects migration, we shouldn't only be looking at the number of people coming, but also at the number of people going back. We look at the circulation. That is where it gets tricky. And we have a lot of research evidence over the last half a century already that what often happens is that ill-conceived immigration restrictions not only drive migration underground, but perhaps more importantly, they interrupt the natural process of circulation, the constant moving back of migrants. And where it often leads to is that you have increased permanent settlement instead of, so more people actually, less people go back, and that means people start to settle permanently. And that also explains why many migration policies often have backfired, for instance, in the case of the United States or in the case of Europe. The other idea is that illegal migration is spinning out of control. It is tied to images of a growing tide of migrants and refugees desperately trying to reach the shores of the wealthy West. Well, there are definitely border crises happening, but to think or to make this representative of what is going on in the rest, in general, would be taking things out of perspective. For instance, 9 out of 10 Africans migrating to Europe migrates with papers and passports in their hand. Many people are surprised because what we see is images of boats and things going wrong. I don't want to trivialize those things, but we still need to put this in a broader perspective. Otherwise, we get a completely skewed image of what is going on in the world. And the same applies for refugee migration. Research I conducted with my colleague Sonja Fransen showed that there is no long-term increase in refugee migration. Of course, we see hikes, but we shouldn't extrapolate them in the future. Refugees represent roughly 10% of all international migrants, roughly 0.3% of the world population. Unfortunately, increases in numbers reported by UNHCR and other refugee agencies are somehow slightly misleading because they include more and more countries over time and suddenly include internally displaced, which were not included in previous statistics. That doesn't mean there is no problem. It means the increase is completely inflated in some of the data I often see. And I think that is problematic. I can imagine organizations do that to attract the attention, but it may unintendedly also contribute to this idea there is simply too many refugees. We can't deal with it. And I think that's a big political risk we are taking as a research community if we do that. It's not a crisis of numbers. It's a crisis of political will. Or to quote James Hathaway, the only refugee crisis is a refugee protection crisis. Third myth, development in poor countries will reduce migration. In the light, indeed, of the failure to erect a fortress Europe or to secure the US border over the last 3 to 4 decades, many have said that we can only curb migration if we address the root causes of migration, if we help people to stay at home. This is a favorite myth, particularly on the left, and it sounds very logical. It is a bit problematic, though. We have evidence that development in poor countries generally leads to more migration. And that is because increasing income, education, and better infrastructure generally give people the aspirations and capabilities to move over increasingly large distances. And it is no coincidence that the major immigration countries in the world are middle-income countries. And based on a lot of evidence collected and a lot of studies collected, we could say that any form of development in the poorest regions of the world is likely to lead to more migration within countries from rural to urban and more migration out of those countries. It doesn't mean that poverty and violence and never lead to migration, but it tends to be short distance migration. Migration, we need to recast migration, not as this desperate flight from misery, But generally, migration is rather an investment in the better future of entire families. So we need to revisit this idea of migration as a desperate flight from misery. We also need to be more critical of this victim thinking. Migrants do have agency, despite the problems they may try to leave. The poorest in the world actually have no options to move. They often are the ones who get stuck. They are the involuntary immobile. And this is also one of the most important reasons why climate change is unlikely to lead to mass migration across continents, as some have predicted, but is clear has no real scientific basis. That doesn't mean that climate change is not a problem. The point is more that the ones most affected by migration, by climate change, are the ones who have no option to leave out. Those who get stuck into immobility, into dangerous situations. And that is the same for violence. So what do we do? What do we do? And it brings us in a way back to the original question. Why have policies not achieved what they aim to do? And I'm particularly talking about attempts by the United States and European Union to stop unauthorized migration across their borders. What I can say is over the last I've been doing migration research for the last 30 years now, that it's more of the same, and it doesn't really work. Now, if development is not going to stop this, what is happening? I think what is missing from standard narratives about migration is what is arguably the main driver of immigration, which is labor demand in destination countries. That has really been the driving force of why people still keep on crossing borders, even if states try to stop it. Of course, we have refugees, but it's a relative minority of migrants. Of course, one immigration myth has been already mentioned is immigrants take away jobs and things like that. And we know there is no evidence for that. We have to turn the whole causality around. Migrants don't take jobs, they don't steal jobs, they come to pick up vacancies. And it's no coincidence that there's an extraordinarily high correlation between business cycles and levels of immigration, with more migrants coming when labor is scarce and many returning when the economy is doing bad and unemployment is rising. And from that perspective, the most effective way to curb migration is to wreck your economy. And that is, of course, what politicians don't want. It's labor demand, not so much poverty or inequality, that is the most important root cause of immigration. Otherwise, most migrants wouldn't have come, wouldn't have made all those investments because migration is expensive to cross borders, legally or illegally. There's a huge discursive gap between politicians' tough talk on immigration and the much more lenient policy practices. I'm not only talking about politicians allowing more and more legal migrants in, particularly the high skilled, but the hypocrisy is most visible in the wild-scale toleration of illegal labor. Politicians in practice, also those who talk very tough on immigration, are all too happy to turn a blind eye towards these practices. As proven by the almost laughably low levels of workplace enforcement. For instance, in recent years in the United States, on 33 million employers, only 10 to 15 every year got persecuted for employing undocumented migrants. I'm not saying we should have mass persecution of undocumented migrants, but I'm saying it reveals the hypocrisy, talking about securing borders, but still allowing these practices to happen. And of course, that's also where we need to think about when we think about more effective policies. If we only talk about development, poverty, controlling borders, and we don't address the labor demand issue, I don't have time for that here, we are not having a real debate. And what I conclude in my book as well is that the real debate about immigration is a migration about the kind of society and economy we want to live in. So I hope that these examples convince you that we need a new paradigm, a new narrative on migration, beyond simplistic pro-anti frames or simplistic and actually misleading push-pull models. And I wrote this book out of a sense of urgency that the public deserves to know these facts about migration, to look through the smokescreen, distorted images, and plain lies of politicians. Because we reached a toxic level of polarization on migration, with the rise of far right reaching dangerous levels all across the West. And with this book, I try to summarize and disclose a century of migration scholarship to the general public. Because I have lost hope that talking just direct to politicians will solve the issue, because politicians will tell me that they know the truth but can't implement it because it would be political suicide. So I think we need a broader awareness in society about migration. And I hope I contribute to this a little bit. I certainly didn't write the book to have the last word, but I hope it will inspire readers to tell new stories about migration and also to challenge the powers that be in how they cast migration. And particularly stress that migration, yes, is literally of all times. We need to see migration as a normal process. Perhaps that's a cliche, but I think it is time to take that cliche seriously. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Hein, and I'm sure that will trigger some comments, queries, questions from the floor, and we want to hear from you shortly. But we are now going to turn to California, if we may, and welcome Jose, albeit virtually, into this meeting. And many, many thanks, Jose, for taking the time to be with us today, such a distance. And my question to you is, again, from your perspective, how do you see the media's discussion of migration to be evolving? And what is the nature, in your view, of the relationship in terms of influence between the media, policy makers, and the public in shaping that discourse? Please, Jose, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. I am totally overly caffeinated, and that's how I'm staying awake. It's really a privilege to be with all of you. I have fantasized about visiting Geneva at some point. I don't know when immigration reform is going to pass in this country, but I hope to see it soon. It's about 1:45 a.m. here in California, in Los Angeles. Almost 31 years ago, actually, my mother in the Philippines woke me up in the morning and told me I was going to America. She dropped me off at the airport, the Ninoy Aquino International Airport in Manila. And 2 days later, I landed not far from where I'm sitting right now, which is, I think, 10 miles away at the Los Angeles International Airport. I have actually not left the United States since then. So that's almost more than 30 years of being here. Because I am undocumented and because of a broken and outdated immigration system, if I leave America, here where I've grown up, where I went to school, where I built my life, the country that I've considered my home, led by a government that I paid quite a lot of taxes to all these years, I face a 10-year bar from trying to come back here, and there would be no guarantee that I would be allowed back. That's why when the organizers of this event invited me to speak at this gathering, I said, sure, I can't fly there, but at least I can do it over Zoom. And actually, to be totally honest, this is actually one of the very few times that I've agreed to speak at an international conference. And I'm doing it over Zoom. And I must name the reality that I'm using pieces of technology. I'm speaking to you from this laptop using Zoom right next to my iPhone. Technology that have more rights to travel than I do as a human being. And though I may not have the privilege to travel internationally and be with you in person, I do have the right to tell my story. That's where my agency is. And telling my story in itself is its own kind of liberation. And so my liberation, such as it is, started 13 years ago, actually, against the advice of more than 20 immigration lawyers when I wrote this essay that you're seeing right now on the slide here. When I wrote this essay for the New York Times Magazine, detailing how I managed to live as an undocumented immigrant here in America. This essay was published in 2011, the same year that President Obama ended up deporting some 400,000 immigrants. I was prepared to be one of those 400,000 immigrants, and that was 12 years ago. Why I have not gotten deported, I have no idea. I've gotten arrested twice, but was released the last time almost 10 years ago. But that's just been the reality. And on the very day that the New York Times published my essay, my friends and I publicly launched a nonprofit media organization called Define American. Today's event is about preserving migrant dignity. I join here today to affirm that immigration is a human rights issue. Our work at Divine American is centered in ensuring that immigrants are shown in their full humanity when our stories are being told. Today's conversation is about the migration narrative because stories is how we see ourselves in each other. The principal way we tell stories is through media, across mediums, and media offers us a canvas on which to illustrate vivid, authentic, and complex and nuanced representation of immigrants, and to build a culture of belonging. However, and all you have to do is look at YouTube and look at TikTok, media can also reinforce harmful narratives that fuel xenophobia and harm immigrants in the real world. So at Divine American, we believe that storytelling is the most powerful and impactful form of communication. Storytelling activates conversations which build into narratives about immigrants. By centering people and stories, we can create conditions for policies and politics rooted in human rights. Now, at a time when immigrants, regardless of status, are continuously and increasingly vilified, when so much misinformation and disinformation are spread about immigrants as people and immigration as an issue, so much so in this country that it actually elected a president once. A few years ago, it may re-elect him again here. When it is vital that immigrants are represented in our full humanity. I don't know if you know this, but the latest United States Census estimates that more than 45 million immigrants call America home. 45 million, 11 million of whom are undocumented. Contrary to popular belief, immigrants from Asia, not Latin America, are the fastest growing immigrant group in this country. Filipinos, Indians, Chinese, Koreans. 1 in every 10 Black Americans living in this country right now is an immigrant. 1 out of 10. Multiracial Americans, many of them from immigrant families from Asia, Latin America, Africa, and the Caribbean, make up the fastest growing demographic in the country. 1 out of 10. Because of immigrants, America is more diverse than ever before in its history. And in the land of differences, stories foster connection among us. So at Divine American, we elevate and celebrate storytellers who are immigrants and those who tell immigrant experiences through our platform, tools, and resources. We develop and lead research. I think research is so crucial right now. And the creation of accessible tools about narrative change strategies for partners across fields who are storytellers about immigrant experiences. And lastly, we collaborate with partners across mediums, sectors, and industries as experts on applying narrative research to storytelling about immigrant experiences. So what we're about to share here, our goal is to be a resource for anyone. You may be a TV writer, a journalist, a film director, an author, a theater producer, a video game developer and designer. And if you want to tell an authentic, accurate, and humane story about immigrants, go to us. And actually last week, the slide you're seeing here, last week we launched at the Sundance Film Festival in Utah, our team distributed the latest version of our media reference guide. The guide, this guide you're seeing right here, is essential to understand the facts, context, and stories of immigrants here in the United States. And because of a robust, well-funded, well-organized anti-immigration and anti-immigrant media machine, so powerful that it helped elect the president and may re-elect that president, this guide helps correct many lies, misperceptions, and myths that populate so much of what we know about immigrants. Here are some, right? Here in the United States, and actually all over the world, this idea of the Great Replacement, inciting fear by claiming that demographic shifts are part of an intentional and widespread conspiracy to replace the white population with people of color. The book that I'm actually working on now that I'm trying to finish is all about, wait a second. So before all these immigrants came from Europe, they were something else before they were white, right? So the construction of whiteness in America and where that fits with all the immigrants that are now here who are neither white or Black in a country which racial foundational binary is Black or white. Now, in reality, here in the United States, without immigration, the white population in the U.S. would have declined last year. Since the start of the pandemic in April 2020, the white population has grown by 391,000 people, all of it driven by immigration. And here's another myth, a commonly held misconception that immigrants come to the US to take job opportunities from native-born citizens. The previous panelists talked about this. But in reality, there are several factors that cause people to immigrate. War, natural disasters, gender inequality, political corruption, and better lives for their children. And of course, climate change, right? And those who do immigrate often fill unique positions in the US workforce by procuring in-demand jobs and become a part of the fabric of American society. I'm speaking to you here in California, where a full third of the entire labor force in this state, which is what, the fourth largest economy in the world, a third of the labor force are immigrants in the state of California. Now, here's another myth. Actually, this is something that we're working on at Define American. Our research with the Norman Lear Center at USC, the University of Southern California, revealed a really shocking statistic. 40% of all immigrant characters on television, right, here in the United States, or you can stream it on Netflix and Hulu and all that, 40% of all immigrant characters on television were associated with crime. Right, an all-time high since 2018, right? In reality, native-born U.S. citizens are actually more than twice as likely to be arrested for violent crimes than immigrants. Moreover, immigrants are 30% less likely to be incarcerated than U.S.-born white people, and 60% less likely to be incarcerated than U.S.-born Black people. As the relative size of foreign-born population increases, the rate of violent crime, murder, and robbery actually decreases. The guide, as a journalist and as a writer, language really matters. And the guide also breaks down the different terms when stories about migrations are told. So, as a journalist, I can't really overstate the lack of understanding that many journalists in the United States, particularly journalists on television and pundits that populate cable news, the lack of just misunderstanding about what immigration is as a process and as an issue, and to differentiate the terms in which people are labeled, right? So what is an asylum seeker and what is a climate migrant? This is in our guide. What is the difference between an immigrant and a migrant? What is a non-immigrant, right? In the United States, in the context of our history, what is a migrant worker? And what is the distinction between someone who is a refugee and someone who is undocumented or unauthorized? Here in the United States, the language we use to discuss immigration does not recognize the realities of our lives based on the conditions that we did not create and in many ways cannot control. For the most part, why are white people called expats while people of color are called immigrants and migrants? Why are some people called expats while others are called immigrants? What's the difference between a settler and a refugee? I would make an argument that language itself, the very language we use, the vocabulary, the grammar we have, is itself a barrier to information, a fortress against understanding the inalienable instinct of human beings to move. And we just hope that wherever you are in the world, we share the same goal, to tell the human stories behind migration on a global scale, right? So please, if you have a chance, go to Define American, download the guide, and share it with your network. In closing, I just wanted to note that I arrived here in the United States in August 1993. In December 1993, Toni Morrison became the first Black woman to receive the Nobel Prize for Literature. If you haven't read her speech on the power of language, I highly recommend it's on YouTube. You can look at the language. She's been so meaningful to me as somebody who's had to create language around what it means to be free in this country, what it means to be an undocumented gay Filipino in the United States, in which my rights as a minoritized person can often be relegated to second-class status, whatever that may be. And in this speech that she gave about the power of language, She said that narrative radical, creating us at the very moment it is being created. And I think what we need as a society here in the United States and globally is a whole new narrative strategy around how we talk about migrants and the natural way that we as human beings move and have moved throughout history. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you very much, Jose. You function remarkably well when over-caffeinated. I really do appreciate you staying up with us. You're welcome to stay up some more, but we'll fully understand if you discreetly just press the off button and go to bed. Thank you again. It's now my great pleasure to turn to our final panelists, and she'll help us segue into hearing from you. Of course, this is Rose Kobusinge. I was looking at this word cloud as it evolved, and youth and climate mobility have remained prominent amongst the ideas that you have thrown out there, which is, I think, as it should be. So what advice do you have, Rose, as to how we can actually affect change? You were listening to the DG and her opening comments saying, in addition to the chat, what is it we can actually do? What advice do you have in that regard, please?
Thank you, Jonathan. And of course, I'm not surprised to see youth and climate mobility come out strongly. We have the biggest constituents of the world, and happy to see that this time we are the front, right? Yeah. I mean, I think what is really interesting for me is the different thoughts that are coming through, and some of them may actually be contradicting to the youth perspectives. And if you ask me why, is I think, as you know, I'm a climate advocate. You may think like the first thing I'll say is climate change is the biggest challenge of the world. Of course, that's true, and especially to the young children and the women and the young people, because for us, I'm from Uganda, and for me, I see climate displacement right in my home, right in the eyes, and I work with communities that were displaced 3 years ago, and they're still living in an internally displaced camp, and they've been displaced 3 times within that camp. And there are no plans of resettlement. I mean, the will to resettle them is there, but the resources and the political will that Hein was talking about is not that much there. And I mean, talking about climate change, I think for us, the global south, climate change is not a matter of greenhouse gases. No, it's a matter of food security, water security, a matter of livelihoods, a matter of, health, mental health, physical health. And again, talking about this IDP camp is found in western region of the country in Kasese. It's called Mohokia. When the floods came in 2020 during COVID, crisis after crisis during COVID, and then the flood happened, and the biggest hospital, that hospital has been there since the 1950s, was flattened. It's a regional hospital. It's not even a small hospital. It's the hospital that has the biggest maternity area for women. And when the flood happens, it was gone. Most of it was gone. And houses were flattened completely. And to me, is it the climate? Is it more of the climate crisis now? Because when you ask people, what is your biggest challenge? They're like, I want to make a living. I want to be resettled somewhere safer. And by the way, the first thing, they don't even think about Europe or US. No, they just want to be somewhere within their community where they have access to their family, their relatives, but make a living. So, and that comes to livelihoods and finance for the grassroots communities. Whatever we say here, we can go through the processes and the good documents. Of course, they're important, but they're not the most important. If we cannot get climate finance to the groups that need it the most, to the grassroots, to the young people and women groups, and that is not going to happen through mechanisms that ask for 10 years of experience, 5 years of reporting and audits. That's not going to happen. I appreciate that mechanism through the government. It's important also, but I think for me to see real change, look at the partners in this room. Like, I think we can do so much together. I was impressed. I'm looking at members, at states. I'm looking at the UN agencies. I'm looking at the youth constituents. I'm like, there's so much potential in this room that we can get funds to the young people, to the people that need it the most. And the funds I'm talking about, I'm not just talking about, the loss and damage fund and adaptation fund. I think we need to figure out other ways, not to wait for the bureaucracies of where is the fund going to go through? How much is like we have the private sector, we have the philanthropies, we have the governments. They can pull funds together and get them to the grassroots. The other thing I also want to talk about is the capacity building. And the capacity building I'm not talking about the many online courses that everyone is trying to do. I mean, they're not bad, but I think I'm talking about more of skilling, and this doesn't have to be only online, because when you do online, for us in Uganda, the digital penetration is still very low, especially for the communities that are actually at the front line of the climate crisis. No access to internet. The internet is very expensive, actually. No access to smartphones. So how do you skill the young people that don't have access to internet? So we need to change what we are calling capacity building. We need to, what I'm trying to say is, like, there's a group that can do the online, but we need to get back on the grassroots, on the ground, and do the skilling. And this needs to be strategic, because we can actually do the skilling of displaced people and people at the verge of displacement, people at the front line of displacement, and so that they can contribute to the just transition. Is it energy? Is it climate smart agriculture? In line with the country's priorities. So capacity building is very important, and also in terms of contributing to policy. As young people, we don't want to just be consulted. We want to lead the processes. We want to lead the activities. We want to learn how to lead consultations, like the GCM consultations that are coming, the regional consultations that are coming on board. And we want to be part of those, not as participants, but as leaders, as conveners, as mobilizers, and as editors of these documents. Lastly, I also wanted to say, I always usually forget that I've written something. I also wanted to say that research and data is very important. The evidence is very important. And because the reason why I'm saying that is a little bit contrary to what Hein said, that actually, I think when you are at the front line, you can actually see that, especially for rapid onset events, you can actually see how much they're causing displacement. You can see that, I don't even know how to explain this, because my understanding of this phenomenon of, yes, there's already poverty, which is the biggest problem more than the climate, and inequality. But for rapid onset events, I've met people who were not super well off, but comfortable. But then a disaster came and wiped everything, and they had to start from zero. So, and that is why I'm saying, I think it's research and data to evidence the nuances of displacement and migration related to climate, poverty, and inequality is very important. And we currently have a situation going on, I don't know how to call it, with many young people, especially from the sub-Saharan Africa, moving to the Gulf countries. And that is mostly because of the failure in livelihoods, and of which mainly is agriculture, because you find more than 60% of our economies depend on agriculture, and over 70% of the population are connected directly or somehow indirectly to the agriculture sector. So that failure, you find many young people moving to the Gulf countries because there's demand for cheap labor and skilled labor, and because they end up going in irregular ways. I think since we're talking about narratives, you're going to try to avoid calling people illegal. Mm-hmm. And they're going using irregular ways, and many of them are dying in the deserts before they actually reach their destination. And some are dying within the Mediterranean, trying to cross to Europe and elsewhere. So, and research and data to bring that evidence, I think for some of the people, the policy makers and the politicians we are talking about, sometimes they need to see that data and evidence. And as young people, we are already doing that. We're already engaged in research. And for the researchers in the room, we call you to come on the ground and do evidence-based research out of the desks and out of the offices. And because there's no more evidence than lived experiences when you see it actually. And that research and data is really important to showcase the challenges, but most importantly, the opportunities and the skills and the knowledge that these people at the verge of migration or people that are moving actually have.
Thank you very much, Rose. What I take from that, please. It is a few observations just coming in from that, is that as we look at climate, it's wrong really just to see that through the prism of migration, but really security for families, capacity to develop a sustainable living wherever that may be. Fundamental, basic right. Secondly, I think an appeal to all of us, donors and the UN, very elegantly put, let me unpack it, that our funding mechanisms are sometimes a little unwieldy, and how we can better get resources to those who not just most need it, but most know how to spend it sensibly. And I hope you can stay, Rose, for the session after the coffee break on the multi-partner trust fund, and we can hear your voice. And then thirdly, that the appeal for youth to actually be meaningfully engaged in leading some of these discussions. And I would certainly invite you to a conversation about how that could be the case within the network system that we've set up. And I hope that's something we can take forward. Thank you very much.
One more.
Please.
One more that I think Rose captured really well, which is that we need to ourselves avoid being trapped in the narrative of south to north migration. Because what we've heard Rose just talk about is migration within countries, migration within regions. We actually know the vast amount of migration is happening regionally. It's happening from rural areas to urban areas. Yet, if you were to look at the headlines, you would think everybody is migrating north. So let's keep our aperture open as we have this conversation. Thanks very much.
Indeed, thank you very much. And thank you really to all the panelists for their comments. I really do think this fit the bill in terms of setting the scene. And we'd now like to hear from you, please. And a couple of individuals and states have already indicated they would like to take the floor. So I'm going to turn, if I may, to the permanent representative of Kazakhstan, followed by Ecuador, Turkey, and Mexico. If I may turn to Ecuador.
Muchas gracias, señor moderador.
Thank you very much, moderator. Dear colleagues, Madam Director General, panelists, we would like to thank you for the introductory words of the Director General and those who've intervened from the UN Network on Migrations, and all of the team from the network and the Secretariat for all of their work which allows us to be able to have those elements that allow us to implement the GCM so that we can get to this safe, orderly and regular migration. We also take note of the recent launching of the strategic plan for 2024-2028, which gives us a great base from which to continue to strengthen the work undertaken by the network so that member states can perceive an effective support through the whole UN family. On the other hand, we would also like to thank panelists for their commentaries and for those essential issues on the international agenda in terms of migration, which include reflections on the practical, working and long-term effects of migration flows, amongst other issues. By undertaking this conversation about these key issues of migration in the international community, it becomes even more relevant if we think about the significant increase in migrants in coming years through flows from different regions around the world, including the growing number of people who migrate through irregular flows and who risk their lives in doing so, and those of their family members. On the other hand, within the thematic themes within migration, we should continue to explore solutions that allow us to continue to fight against any form of intolerance, discrimination, or xenophobia, with our focus firmly placed on human rights, and so as to avoid destructive, negative, and false messaging. And Ecuador feels that it's really fundamental to continue to articulate this internationally so that we're able to promote a positive role in migration in origin countries. We need to speak about the adaptivity and resilience of migrants and the host countries and reception countries, and we have to think about this in terms of migrants' well-being in the long term. And this issue is particularly relevant in the case of Ecuador as a country of origin, transit and return of immigrants, who stands firm to its humanitarian tradition and continues to be one of the main refugee welcoming countries in the country, with more than 70,000 in the region and more than 500,000 foreigners. And this is why, within the context of the International Review Forum, we continue to work together with Canada and the Mayor's Network on public narratives about migration, bearing into account the importance of effective and adequate information on migratory flows.
We would also like to reiterate our commitment with the implementation of the progress declaration stemming from the first exam forum, in the framework of which we need to articulate holistic solutions, allowing us to build inclusive societies, engaging all public organizations and international organizations member to the network. In this sense, allow me to conclude by calling member states and other relevant stakeholders to contribute to the design and establishment of mechanisms allowing for a sound implementation of the GCM, and to the extent of our possibilities through plans, programs, and specific policies. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much indeed for those comments. This is going to be my, I take these off. This is going to be my first appeal of the day. I have a speakers list of about 9 speakers, and we have 14 minutes left before the coffee break. So I would really appeal to colleagues to make their interventions short and sweet, recognizing that over 2 days we'll be able to make several more goes with the mic. So with that, I'd like to turn over to the representative from Mexico, please.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you to the 3 panelists. I will be very, very quick and actually have 2 concrete questions, very practical ones. So I was particularly touched by the presentation made by José Antonio. I completely agree that this issue of migration narratives is going to be a critical one this year, when almost half of the world population will go to the polls. At the core of this issue, clearly, the problem, the challenge is the fact that migration narratives continue to be driven by perception and by very strong emotions rather than on data. So the first question is, there are many efforts currently to gather better data, to inform these narratives. However, what can we do to make sure that this data is really impactful? And by that, I mean that we are able to gather data that reflects, for example, the taxes that migrants contribute with, the number of businesses owned by migrants, the number of jobs that they contribute to create. That's on the one hand. On the second point is, once we have that data, what type of partnerships do we need to make inside societies and communities to make sure that this data transcends a mere bullet point or an infographic and really impact the narrative? So in other words, to make sure that we can be effective in really changing that narrative. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd now thank you for those questions, and they're well noted, and I hope we can actually continue in the coffee break and throughout the 2 days to reflect on those. I think those are two very important points we need to drill down on. I'd now like to give the floor to the permanent representative of Kazakhstan, please.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Dear DG, panelists, excellencies, and ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank today's panelists for introducing the topics of our discussions in such open and engaging way. We agree that implementation of a GCM requires such approaches that respond to emerging challenges, and also the ways to enhance our cooperation and collaboration. I would like taking this opportunity to share our experience, because I think that adoption of the GCM has been a milestone in the development of good governance of migration. Its objectives also, for these reasons, its objectives are also integrated in our Kazakhstan's program and the policy documents. And we are taking consistent measures to improve the regulation of migration processes. So, of course, no region is immune to these global challenges, such as climate change, decent work deficit, and the food shortages, including our Central Asia region. And because, as researchers project, the rising of temperatures and a decrease in crop yields in our region of Central Asia might lead to around 5 million internal climate migrants just by 2050. And people living in vulnerable areas will have to find new pastures, new homes, and new sources of income. My country, together with partners in Central Asia, is working to address the challenges resulting from the mixed migration dynamics within the existing Almaty process. So I think that this platform can be and should be used to discuss ways to expand humanitarian pathways and facilitate international labor migration in our region, and to have its impact. We are also working on minimizing the negative impacts of climate change, so on water sector. As chair of the International Fund for Saving the Aral Sea, Kazakhstan looks forward to engaging all partners, including within this network, migration network, to support the fund. Moreover, together with France, Kazakhstan this year will co-chair the first One Water Summit on the margins of the coming UN General Assembly. So, dear participants, we believe that along with pledges, the world needs actions, as just rightly mentioned by Director General Amy Pope, on the ground. And Kazakhstan is committed to working with its partners within the UN network on migration. So I think that as a good contribution to this, taking this opportunity, I invite you all to the Astana International Forum, June this year, which will allow us to continue focused collaboration and our cooperation in finding ways how to overcome global challenges, including climate change, energy security, and conflicts. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments and for that invitation. In my eternal quest to manage time. We have 9 minutes left, and I'm going to ask the following, please, to be on standby. Firstly, we'll start with the representative from Türkiye, and then if I could turn to our colleague from the United States, and then I'd like to hear from the UN system, and if we can turn to Stephen Jackson, the resident coordinator in Kenya, and it would be remiss if I didn't also ask the Migrant Youth Community Platform to take the floor to end this session before we enter our coffee break. So please, sir, from the Permanent Mission of Türkiye, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jonathan. Turkey is a country of origin, country of transit, country of destination. Therefore, we try to have a holistic approach to the issue of migration. Hence, our cooperation with this organization has been always great and fruitful. The AMI has pointed out, Director General has pointed out an important thing. The elections are coming. Elections are coming. We know only one pope. The elections are coming, and many of these elections will take place in countries of destination, where the political discussion is a little bitter, where the political discussion is mixed and tainted with rhetoric of racism, xenophobia. Therefore, we have some challenging times ahead that requires cooperation. On our part, we are ready to do our part, further continue our cooperation and coordination with you, first of all, the organization, and our other international partners. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that intervention. I'd now like to turn to the United States, please.
Thank you, Jonathan. And thank you, Director General Pope, and to our panelists for setting the stage for our conversations over the next 2 days. Sustaining public confidence in migration policies is both a priority and a major challenge for us and for all governments. This is why a deeper understanding of how the public thinks about migration can be so useful. And as so astutely noted by Professor Haas, public attitudes are much more complex than being pro or anti-migration. Most people toggle between positive and negative feelings on migration. Policymaking and communications efforts can be both more effective and more innovative if they are sensitive to the nuances of public attitudes. We also believe that public trust can be increased by strengthening the role of local communities, both in refugee integration and ensuring communities see the benefits of immigration and newcomers. And I'll just throw out to the panelists and to all of us here, as I know we are running out of time in this particular session, but what do we see collectively as ways to increase public trust? And then finally, I would like to just close with how much we appreciated the intervention by the Youth Migration Ambassador, Ms. Kobusinge, and we support increased space to allow for meaningful participation by youth in these conversations. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments and those questions. I am going to take the liberty of offering up our panelists to speak to you all during the coffee break and try and unpack some of these issues as we move forward and indeed on into the afternoon and tomorrow. I'd now like to turn to Stephen Jackson, please.
Thank you, Jonathan. Stephen Jackson, a proud North-South migrant all my career. And I don't say that lightly. I found this panel very, very inspiring, but really pointing to the need for us to go on the offensive at the level of language. Getting more data is certainly essential, but it won't be enough getting better data. What the reactionary right has become very good at doing on this file, but on many others, is on seizing the framing of the debate globally and nationally. And they're extremely good at it. There are many examples from other domains where the reactionary right has been able to define the terms of the debate because they seize the language. So that's what we have to do. And so changing the narrative, there are lots of good techniques for doing this from which we can learn, but we need a global, forgive me the word, offensive on this. And I do think one word that came up a couple of times, and I'll finish here in a couple of the presentations, was mobility. It is impossible to be against mobility. You can't. It's like opposing motherhood. I think we need to put the emphasis on how important mobility has always been to humankind, how important it is to the 21st century world, and we revalue that. Thank you.
Come at any point. And then I would like to turn to the representative from MYCP. With apologies, I mangled your name the previous time. This is the Migrant Youth and Children Platform. Please.
Thank you. Thanks to the floor, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Alexandra Noitz Menendez, and I'm the Europe Regional Lead at Migration Youth and Children Platform, MYCP, the Migration Youth constituency of the Major Group for Children and Youth. At MYCP, we believe that in order to ensure youth participation in the GCM and with UNNM, we need to, 1, know in advance about potential opportunities for participation, like the topic and estimated dates, so that we can organize a call for expression of interest among our wide network, deliver capacity building, and to allow meaningful youth engagement. And 2, as a good practice, the Migration Youth and Children Platform is coordinating policy surveys as part of the GCM regional review process, with a special focus on youth migrants at the grassroots level, including climate mobility as one of our top priorities. We're aiming for solutions for regional migration issues to be heard by our local decision makers in the MENA region, Europe, North America, and Africa. We do call to all the different stakeholders to support initiatives as our meaningful engagement in youth at the GCM process engage. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And your suggestions there to improve our communications are well noted, and we will take those on board. Now, with that, I think we're on time, which makes me happy. So you can all proceed outside this room for a coffee break. Please do continue these conversations. But before we do, I would just like another round of applause for the Director General and the panelists.